Hey, it's Viet from Sensei Swag Mini Art. I've been promising a paint tutorial for years now, so here you go. Today, I woke up and I decided I didn't have quite enough Imperial Knights. My house Taranis army only has 52 suits, when in reality, it needs at least 100. I've been neglecting the Taranis boys for the last few years, so it's finally time to add to them. Immediately after picking up the tray that had the Porphyrion from the top shelf, I dropped the whole thing on the ground and the knight broke into many pieces. After some zip ties and duct tape, our boy is finally ready to paint. I didn't film the priming, but I first primed the model with black primer and shot it with Citadel lead belcher. The Citadel sprays are extortionately expensive, and you save a lot of money if the model is primed black first. Now, onto some actual painting. Obviously, with an army as large as this one, I can't afford to spend days on one model. I'm going to be taking every shortcut to reduce the painting time as much as possible. The first 2,000 points I painted for this army was done in a weekend. The first step is to paint all of the red parts with Citadel Corn Red. With the way this scheme works, you can paint the entire model with the paintbrush, but I'm lazy, so an airbrush it is. A lot of people don't want to use an airbrush for whatever reason, but the way I see it, I could cut my lawn with a pair of scissors, but a lawnmower is much faster. Actually, I just paid the neighbor's kid to cut my grass, but whatever. If you are painting with the brush, lucky you, you won't have to paint the trim later, just keep the paint between the lines. Also, another tip, if you are painting with the brush, or even with an airbrush I guess, I'd recommend you use Pro Acryl's Burnt Red instead of the Citadel Corn Red, because Pro Acryl is superior to Citadel in almost every single way. My army was started before I even knew what Pro Acryl was, so I'm stuck using Corn Red. The next step will be to get all the white panels blocked in. This will be the front shoulder pads and the outside of any shin pads on every knight. Any white paint will work for this. I'm using Vallejo white primer, but you should use Pro Acro Bold Titanium white or their white primer. Rachel took the Pro Acro paints with her, so I'm stuck using this Vallejo white primer here. The Pro Acro white has the best coverage of any white I've ever used, and can be painted in 2 thin coats by hand. If you are using Citadel paints, Corax white will be your best bet, but Pro Acro white is actually white, where the Corax white is more of a light gray, and the Corax white will take more coats to cover. After the white is done, we're going to do the same thing, but with black. I'm using Vallejo black primer, but any black paint will do. This color will go on the inside of the shin pads and the back of the shoulder pads. Now we could spend a lot of time masking off the red and white parts, but I'm lazy, so I'm going to be using a business card to block any of the overspray from getting onto the other colors or the metal. Inevitably, there will be some overspray with the black and the white, so I take a brush with thinned down Corn Red to cover up any mistakes on the armor. Unfortunately, Corn Red will not fix a mistake I made when I decided to date this bitch named Moving on, the next step will be the most difficult part, and that is painting the trim. I'm just taking thinned down lead belcher and going over all of the trim and any metal that was oversprayed with the armor colors. If you want to speed this up, you can load lead belcher into a paint pen and do the armor panels, but I'm much faster with a brush than with the pen. Maybe one day I'll do a tutorial on how to make custom paint pens. Now, there's one more step to do before we can move on to the fun part. To break up the silver of the skeleton, I paint the little nubbins in copper. You can use any copper or bronze color, but I've recently switched over to Pro Acro's copper since it covers in just one coat. Before we go on to the fun part, I forgot to add some small details. I painted the Mechanicus cog in half black and half white, and the missiles in Pro Acro yellow ochre. You can use GW's Ionin Dark Sun, I think is what it's called, if you're using Citadel paints. From here, the knight is already starting to look pretty good, and all we're missing really is decals. To get the decals to look like they were painted on and not look like stickers, I first shot the knight with gloss varnish. You can use any gloss varnish, and I'm using Krylon's gloss varnish because it's the cheapest one available here locally. I think the can recommends that you let the paint dry overnight, but you should be good in about 15 minutes or so depending on the weather. Next, to prep the decals, I brush on some microset to help set the decals. Then it's a simple process of getting the decals onto the model. I use a brush to slide them on and an X-Acto knife to position them in place. Then, when everything is where I want it and completely dry, I use microsol to melt the decals onto the model. Depending on how old your decals are or how thick the material is, looking at you Forge World decals, it can take several passes with the microsol to get perfect. If the decals are really stubborn, I recommend using a cotton buzz soaked in microsol and putting a little bit of pressure. Now that we have a factory fresh death machine, let's give it a little weathering to make it fit into the grim darkness of 40k. I'm not going to be doing anything major like drilling bullet holes, just adding a little bit of paint chips. First, I use corn red to go over the decals to make it look like the symbols are damaged and the original paint is showing through. To do this, get a sponge and dip it into the paint and poke it at a paper towel until you get the pattern that you want. You can use any sponge with fine texture, like the foam at the back of old blister packs or leftover foam from an army transport case. You can repeat this color with the black and the white paint also. Then, to show fresh damage to the paint, I use lead belcher to make it look like the red paint has chipped to bare metal. When I do weathering, I like the paintwork to tell a story and have multiple layers to show that the knight has been fighting for a while without being serviced. Continuing this pattern, I use Pro Acro's black brown on a few small areas on the armor to make it look like older paint chips that have rusted over time. Finally, using Ammo MIG Dio Driver Silver, I start to distress the trim and the metal skeleton. It's okay if some of this gets onto the armor panels too, since this will add more variety. The next step will be to seal all of our hard work before the real weathering begins. You can use any semi-gloss varnish for this. I use Rust-Oleum Matte because I had it on hand, and the can is a lie since the finish is actually more semi-gloss than advertised. At this point, the knight is looking pretty good, and you could just stop here if you just want to get to playing. I want to take the knight a step further and make him into a very, very dirty boy by giving him that real Grimdark treatment. You will want to wait for this varnish to dry a little bit longer than the last one, so that the next paint doesn't mix with the still curing varnish. While you wait, it's the perfect time for Shot O'Clock. Today, I'm doing the Sensei Swag Studio Special, which is Red Bull mixed with whiskey. I don't have Jack Daniels on hand today, so I'm upgrading to 4 roses, and I'm going to need about 5 more of these to finish this model. Okay, time for the really fun part. I'm using Ammo MIG Shrieking Grime for Panzer Grey, heavily thinned down of Gamsol. The amount of Gamsol you want to use depends on how dirty you want the model to be. I would recommend starting with a 50-50 mix and going from there. You could alternatively use mineral spirits or turpentine, but Gamsol is the least likely to give you cancer. I'm not a doctor, and this is not medical advice, by the way. Since I have such a large army of these knights, I varied the ratio between different batches to make the models look a little bit different. This mixture can be applied by a brush or sprayed on with an airbrush. The brush method is cleaner, but the airbrush is definitely faster. Unfortunately, you are more likely to get lung cancer if you're aerosolizing enamel paint and thinner into your workspace. The best way to beat this is by wearing a mask. Then we let the toxic waste dry on the model for as long as you want before the next step. Most people recommend leaving this overnight before continuing in the morning. The longer you leave the paint, the more difficult it will be to remove, and the dirtier your model will be. I usually leave this on the model for an hour or 2, but sometimes I just shoot it with a hairdryer and I'm good to go in 15 minutes. The next step will be to remove the Shrieking Grime and leave it mostly only in the recesses. You can remove as much or as little as you want depending on your taste. I find the best way to remove the Shrieking Grime is with the makeup sponge. You can get these at Walmart or Target or steal them from your girlfriend. Most of you are dirty neckbeards that never shower, so the last one might not be an option for you. If you're too embarrassed to go to the makeup section, you can also use a Q-tip, which is what most people do when painting this style. On an Imperial Knight, however, I find the model to just take way too long using a Q-tip. I find I get the best results moving the sponge in the same direction starting over, instead of just attacking the model randomly to get some cool streaking effects. After the Shrieking Grime, the model is pretty dark, so we need to bring some more life into it. The first step is to get the metals to pop by dry brushing it with Ammo MIG Dio Driver Silver. This is the same color that we used before. I put this on the skeleton, the copper nubbins, and even a little bit onto the armor. I'm sure everyone already knows how to dry brush, so I won't really explain the process here, but I recommend using a cheap makeup brush instead of a normal painting brush. Next, we're going to sponge the same color onto the metal parts to get the freshest paint chips. This can also go over a few spots on the armor plates to show paint damage that just happened on the battlefield. Now that the metal parts really pop, we need to bring some more interest into them because they take up so much of the model. I'm using Vallejo Model Wash Light Rust to add some life into the metal, but especially the trim. I thin it heavily with water and just put it around any interesting details like rivets or anywhere else I think rust might accumulate. I'm using a makeup sponge just after applying the color with a brush to spread it around and make it look more natural. The final step is to paint the lenses and the Night Porphyrion is done. Unfortunately, the footage I filmed at this part for some reason filmed in 360p instead of 4K, but you can easily find hundreds of lens painting tutorials on YouTube. And that's it. We're done. Sometime in the future, I'll do a follow-up video that takes this paint job to the next level with more advanced airbrushing and weathering. You can see this on my Legio Ignatum Titans that are painted very similarly to these House Taranis Knights, but with color modulation and masking effects to get the honeycomb pattern and the spiky hazard stripes. So if you want to see that in the future, please let me know. Not sure when the next video will be up, but we have a lot of fun projects in the studio that I think would make good videos, so subscribe if you want to see them. Bye.